A young woman is found bound to a chair in the basement of her family's home. A single gunshot wound to the head. No forced entry, no struggle upstairs. Just a quiet house in rural Michigan, and a young woman who never should have died there. For years, investigators believed they already knew who pulled the trigger. A jury agreed with them. A man went to prison for life, and then the case fell apart. Not because the evidence was wrong, but because it was incomplete. Hidden inside a single cigarette butt, recovered from the scene in 2011, was a DNA profile that didn't match the man in prison. It didn't match anyone. For over a decade, that profile sat in a database, waiting. What happens when the person a jury convicts isn't the person who actually pulled the trigger? What happens when the real answer is sitting in an evidence locker the entire time, invisible, until science finally catches up? This is the story of Andrea Eilber, a 20-year-old woman who was house-sitting for her aunt and uncle when someone walked into that home and ended her life. It's a story about a wrongful conviction, a case that refused to stay closed, and the strange, unsettling truth that eventually came out 14 years later. The victim. Andrea Eilber was 20 years old in the fall of 2011, living in the small community of Otisville, in northwest Genesee County, Michigan, the kind of place where everyone seems to know everyone, and where a missing person doesn't stay quiet for long. She worked as a cashier at the Kroger grocery store in nearby Lapeer, ringing up groceries for neighbors and regulars, the kind of steady, unglamorous job that fills the early 20s for a lot of young people still figuring out what comes next. Those who knew her described a young woman who found comfort in small, simple pleasures. She loved to cook. She loved music. On her days off, she'd go to the movies. Nothing extravagant, just the quiet rhythms of an ordinary life. Andrea had already known loss by the time she was 20. Her mother had died before her, and by 2011, Andrea's world revolved around her father and her brother, Aaron. Family mattered to her. It's part of why, when her aunt and uncle needed someone to look after their home in Mayfield Township while they were away, Andrea was the natural choice. She was reliable. She was trusted. She said yes. It was at Kroger, ringing up customers and stocking shelves, that Andrea met a coworker named Kenneth Carl Grondin III, known to friends as KC. The two started dating, and by the fall of 2011, they'd been together for roughly 7 months. On the surface, it looked like an unremarkable young relationship, built in a break room and a checkout line. But that relationship would become the center of a criminal case that would take 14 years and 2 separate suspects to fully unravel. None of that was known yet, though. On the second week of November 2011, all anyone knew was that a young woman was house-sitting a relative's home in a quiet township outside Lapeer, and that soon she would stop answering her phone. The crime. On the night of Monday, November 14, 2011, Andrea Eilber was staying at her aunt and uncle's house in Mayfield Township, watching over the property while they were out of town. It was meant to be an unremarkable few days: feed the pets, check the mail, keep an eye on things. By Tuesday night, something was wrong. Andrea's father hadn't heard from her since late Monday. That kind of silence, even for a single day, wasn't like her. As the hours dragged on into Tuesday evening with no call, no text, and no sign of his daughter, worry turned into alarm. At roughly 11:30 p.m. on Tuesday, November 15, Andrea's father picked up the phone and called the Michigan State Police Post in Flint. His daughter was missing. Troopers began searching the area. It didn't take long before they found something troubling. Andrea's car, abandoned on a road near the property, empty. A young woman doesn't simply vanish and leave her car behind, not without a reason, and rarely a good one. Investigators converged on the Mayfield Township home Andrea had been watching. What they found inside would confirm the worst of what her father had feared. Andrea was in the basement laundry room. Bound to a chair, investigators would later determine zip ties had been used to restrain her. She had been shot once in the head. She had been dead for 2 days before she was found. The scene raised immediate and troubling questions. This wasn't a break-in gone wrong, or a robbery that spiraled into violence. There was something deliberate, almost staged, about the way Andrea had been positioned, bound to a chair in a basement laundry room, executed with a single shot. When the Lapeer County Medical Examiner's Office completed the autopsy days later, they delivered an unambiguous conclusion to investigators. There was no way this had been a suicide. Whoever did this had bound Andrea Eilber to that chair, and whoever did this had pulled the trigger. The question that would consume investigators, and eventually 2 courtrooms, was simple to ask and agonizingly difficult to answer. Who? Detectives didn't have to look far before a name surfaced. In the earliest days of the investigation, evidence recovered from Andrea's cell phone pointed them towards someone close to her boyfriend of 7 months, Kenneth K.C. Grondin III, the co-worker she'd met at Kroger. Grondin didn't run. He didn't lawyer up and go silent. Instead, he spoke to investigators voluntarily, giving them his account of what had happened. But what he told them would only deepen suspicion, rather than clear it. According to Grondin's own statements, he had been the one to discover Andrea's body, and rather than immediately calling police, he said he moved it and removed items from the house. His stated reason: he didn't want Andrea's family to believe she had taken her own life. To investigators, that explanation raised more red flags than it settled. Why would an innocent person who discovered his girlfriend's body choose to disturb a death scene rather than call 911 immediately? Why remove items from the home at all? At just 19 years old, Grondin was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in connection with Andrea's death, becoming, in the eyes of Lapeer County prosecutors, both the prime suspect and, at the time, the only suspect. His attorney argued for bail, pointing out that Grondin had deep ties to the community, a job at the local Kroger, and nowhere else to go. Prosecutors saw it differently. They believed they had their man a young boyfriend with access to the victim, a suspicious account of tampering with the scene, and digital evidence from Andrea's phone that tied him to her final hours. The case moved toward trial. Over 12 days, a jury heard the prosecution's case against Kenneth Grondin. In the end, they convicted him of first-degree murder. In 2015, Grondin was sentenced to life in prison, the kind of sentence that, in most cases, closes a chapter permanently. Andrea's family had an answer. The community had a conviction. As far as the state of Michigan was concerned, the person responsible for Andrea Eilber's death was now behind bars, and he would stay there. But there was a piece of evidence from that Mayfield Township crime scene that never quite fit the story the courtroom had told. The loose thread. Back in 2011, alongside the zip ties and the single gunshot wound, investigators had recovered something small and easy to overlook at first glance: a cigarette butt found at the crime scene. It was tested for DNA that same year. What came back was a single male DNA profile, but it didn't match Kenneth Grondin. It didn't match anyone known to be connected to Andrea Eilber, her family, or the investigation at all. It was, in the language of forensic science, an unknown contributor, a stranger's genetic fingerprint sitting inside a locked evidence room, attached to a case that already had its convicted killer. For years, that unidentified DNA profile was run against databases and compared to individuals as they came up in the course of ordinary police work. Every time, the answer came back the same: no match. With a conviction already secured and Grondin serving a life sentence, the cigarette butt became something closer to an unsolved footnote than an active lead, a strange detail in a case that, on paper, had already been closed. It would take years, an appellate court, and a scientific breakthrough to change that. The twist a conviction unravels. In 2018, the case that Lapeer County prosecutors thought they'd closed for good reopened not because of new evidence, but because of the courtroom process itself. The Michigan Court of Appeals reviewed Kenneth Grondin's conviction and found a problem, an issue with the verdict form used during his original 2015 trial. It was a procedural flaw, but a serious one, and it was enough for the appellate court to overturn Grondin's conviction entirely. After years behind bars for a murder he always maintained he did not commit, Grondin was suddenly back in legal limbo, a convicted killer whose conviction no longer legally existed, awaiting a new trial that hadn't yet been scheduled. For Andrea's family, it must have felt like watching the ground shift beneath a case they thought had been settled years earlier. The man they believed had killed Andrea was still the prime suspect, but the legal certainty of a jury's guilty verdict had evaporated. Prosecutors would need to prove their case all over again, or find something stronger than they'd had the first time. Meanwhile, the cigarette butt from 2011 was still sitting in evidence storage, still unmatched, still waiting for the right piece of technology to catch up with it. The breakthrough genetic genealogy. By 2022, the science of forensic DNA analysis had changed dramatically from where it stood back in 2011. A relatively new investigative technique, forensic genetic genealogy, had already helped crack cold cases across the country that traditional DNA database searches alone couldn't solve. Rather than simply checking a DNA profile against a database of known offenders, genetic genealogy builds out family trees from DNA matches, however distant, to work backward toward a single person. With Grondin's retrial still pending and the original DNA profile still unidentified, the Michigan State Police made a decision that would ultimately crack the case wide open. They submitted the cigarette butt evidence to Othram, a private forensic DNA laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, that specializes in extracting usable genetic profiles from degraded or minimal biological evidence, exactly the kind of trace material recovered from a decade-old crime scene. Othram's scientists used what's known as forensic-grade genome sequencing to build a far more detailed and complete DNA profile from the cigarette butt than had been possible back in 2011. From there, the lab's in-house genetic genealogy team searched that profile against genealogical databases, tracing distant genetic relatives and slowly narrowing an entire family tree down toward a single, specific person. The name that emerged from that process was one that had never come up once in over a decade of investigation: Chadwick Shane Mobley, the second suspect. At the time of Andrea's murder in 2011, Chadwick Mobley had been living an ordinary, unremarkable life, just a short drive from where Andrea died. He worked as an EMS technician in Pontiac, Michigan, and lived nearby in Auburn Hills. He had no known connection to Andrea Eilber, to Kenneth Grondin, or to the Mayfield Township property where the murder occurred. His name had never surfaced in the original 2011 investigation, never come up in witness interviews, and never appeared anywhere in the case file that had sent Grondin to prison for a murder he insisted he didn't commit. It's a sobering illustration of exactly why genetic genealogy has changed cold case investigation. Traditional police work depends on connections, on someone knowing someone, on a name surfacing through interviews, relationships, or motive. Mobley had none of the connections investigators would typically look for. He wasn't a person of interest. He wasn't a name on anyone's list. He was, as far as the case file was concerned, a total stranger. Only the DNA left behind at the scene, a single cigarette butt, tied him to that basement in Mayfield Township at all. But by the time investigators identified him as a potential match, Chadwick Mobley was long gone from Michigan. He'd become a long-haul truck driver, living much of his life out of his truck cab as he crossed state lines for work, a lifestyle that, whether by circumstance or design, made him a difficult man to track and an even harder man to quietly collect DNA from. Long-haul drivers on the road rarely leave behind the kind of everyday discarded items, cups, cigarette butts, water bottles, that investigators typically rely on for a confirmatory DNA sample. Law enforcement in Michigan coordinated with authorities in Utah and Montana, where Mobley's movements had placed him, to begin quiet surveillance. It was a patient, methodical process, waiting for the moment Mobley would leave something behind that could be tested and compared against the DNA profile pulled from that 2011 cigarette butt. Eventually, investigators got what they needed: a confirmatory DNA sample from Mobley that matched the profile recovered from the crime scene more than a decade earlier. It was the break that had eluded the case since the day that cigarette butt was first tested and come back unidentified. But knowing wasn't the same as having him in custody. When Michigan State Police moved to formally question Mobley, he didn't stay to answer. Instead, Mobley fled his home in Utah, disappearing from the area shortly after investigators approached him, the act of a man who understood exactly what was closing in. The The search for him ultimately led to Montana. In June of 2023, Chadwick Mobley was located and taken into custody in Libby, Montana, by the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department, working in coordination with Michigan authorities. He was extradited back to Michigan to face charges in a murder that had occurred nearly 12 years earlier, in a state he hadn't called home in years, for a crime almost no one outside of the small circle of investigators chasing that DNA profile had ever connected him to. Chadwick Mobley was charged with first-degree murder, and felony firearm in the death of Andrea Eilber. It created an almost unheard-of situation in Lapeer County. Two men, formally charged at different points, for the same single murder. Kenneth Grondin, his original conviction overturned and awaiting retrial. And now Chadwick Mobley, identified through DNA technology that hadn't even existed in its current form back when Andrea died. Investigators have never publicly disclosed any connection between the two men. No evidence has emerged that Grondin and Mobley knew each other at all. The case moved slowly through the courts, as cold cases resurrected by new evidence often do. But in February of 2025, more than 13 years after Andrea Eilber's death, Chadwick Mobley appeared before Judge Michael Nolan in Lapeer County's 40th Circuit Court and pleaded no contest to first-degree premeditated murder, and felony firearm. A no-contest plea isn't a formal admission of guilt in the traditional sense, but it is an acceptance of punishment, a decision not to contest the charges against him. During that hearing, according to published reports, Mobley told the court that he had been intoxicated at the time of the shooting inside the Mayfield Township home. With Mobley's plea entered, the question of what would happen to Kenneth Grondin's still pending retrial became more urgent. Grondin's attorney reportedly asked prosecutors to drop the charges against his client now that Mobley had accepted responsibility for the killing. Prosecutors, for their part, indicated that a trial date for what they now referred to as a co-defendant had not yet been set, leaving that part of the story, as of the most recent public reporting, still unresolved. Grondin, meanwhile, had been released from custody pending further proceedings, after already having served years in prison for a conviction that had ultimately been overturned. On April 15, 2025, Chadwick Mobley returned to that same Lapeer County courtroom for sentencing. Judge Nolan handed down the maximum available sentence, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel's office marked the sentencing as the resolution of a case that had haunted Lapeer County for over a decade, a case that had once seemed closed, only to be reopened by an appellate ruling, and finally solved by a piece of forensic science that didn't exist in its modern form back when Andrea Eilber died. Andrea Eilber was 20 years old. She liked to cook. She liked music. She went to the movies with people she cared about. She was watching her aunt and uncle's home as a favor, the kind of small, ordinary trust that families extend to each other every single day. And in November of 2011, someone walked into that home, bound her to a chair, and shot her. For over a decade, the story of who did that seemed settled until it wasn't. Kenneth Grondin spent years in prison for a crime his conviction would ultimately be overturned for, based not on new proof of innocence, but on a legal error in how his original trial was conducted. And the man whose DNA was left behind at the scene from the very beginning, a total stranger with no apparent connection to Andrea, her boyfriend, or her family, walked free for over a decade before a single cigarette butt, and the science built to read it, finally caught up with him. This case is a reminder of how fragile certainty can be in the earliest days of an investigation, and how much can hinge on evidence that seems insignificant at the time it's collected. It's also a reminder of what modern forensic genetic genealogy has made possible: cases that once would have stayed cold forever, reopened by tracing a stranger's family tree back to a single name nobody had ever considered. Andrea Eilber didn't get to see justice done in her lifetime. It took her family and the investigators who never stopped comparing that unmatched DNA profile against new names 14 years to get there. However long it takes, some cases refuse to stay closed until the truth finally does. If this case affected you, Share it. Sometimes the smallest piece of evidence, sitting untouched for years, is the one that finally breaks a case wide open.